Super excited to be here with the absolutely prolific. That was a wonderfully put. Dr. Sabiyha Prince. Again, my name is Corey Shaw Jr., Director of the DC Legacy Project, and we're here to talk to you about the history of Berry Farm and then where we're hoping to go in the near future. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump in. Before we get into a bit of the history, I want to talk to you a bit about Empower DC. Empower DC is an organization where we envision DC as a state where human rights are met, systemic harm is exposed and repaired, and then empowered residents shape the decisions that impact their lives. We hope to realize that vision through our mission, which is to build the power of DC residents through resident-led community organizing to advance racial, economic, and environmental justice. Really briefly, I want to jump through our organizational values. These are the 4 pillars of the organization. That is to honor the history, to build the collective power that demands accountability from decision makers, to disrupt inequitable and unjust systems and institutions, and then to persist in the determined and uncompromised pursuit of justice. With that, we're going to sort of very quickly lay out the sort of vision for what we're talking about today. And then I'll be passing it off to Dr. Prince to talk a bit about the history. So we'll talk a little bit about the importance of understanding history. I'll sort of start with that and I'll pass it to Dr. Prince. You'll hear a bit about the displacement in Berry Farm, and then we'll talk about the work of the Legacy Project and the vision that we're looking at employing going forward. So why is history important? I think the crux of it, if I can be really succinct, is if you don't understand history, you can't understand where we came from. And if you don't understand where we came from, you can't begin to imagine a different future. Right. Berry Farm is a very dynamic community. As you'll hear from Dr. Prince, it has a history that dates back to 1867 and sort of walks us into the present day. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and invite Dr. Prince up, and then she'll walk us through that, and I'll be back with you guys shortly.
Good morning. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here with us. And thanks for organizing this wonderful event. Thank you, Corey. So, in terms of this history, I mean, the quest for freedom and justice has long been linked to the desire and the fight for land. And the case of Berry Farm really demonstrates that. It really encompasses those ideals. Um, it's a long history. I will abbreviate that. Basically, at the end of the Civil War, African Americans purchased plots of land from the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau purchased that land from a former enslaver by the name of Berry. So his name is still on the land. This is over in Southeast Washington, D.C., in Ward 8. And this became one of the first Black home owning communities in Washington, D.C. Frankly, it was a community also of Black home builders, because these are folks that built their own homes sometime under cover of darkness with candlelight, etc. So this community would come to be predominated by the population who is at the backbone of the economy here in Washington, D.C., and that's the Black working class. It was also associated with some notable African Americans, such as the children of Frederick Douglass, as well as a woman by the name of Emily Edmondson. She is famous because she was, as an enslaved teenager, she joined approximately 75 people to attempt to escape slavery on a schooner called the Pearl. How many of y'all know that story, or is that familiar to some of us? That schooner departed from 7th Street and the Southwest waterfront, which is now a very fancy schmancy area with a lot of expensive hotels and restaurants, etc. Um, and again, some people consider that attempt to be the largest in American history. This area, we can envision like what this area was like. This was a waterfront community, if you will. People had access to the river, and all of this was dramatically altered through highway construction. I collected oral histories of folks who lived there, and they spoke with me about what it was like. This is over 300 acres. So we have to envision it before the scars were inflicted upon the land. Folks talked about, you know, fishing, hanging out at the river, just enjoying the outdoors, building community and that space. So it's really kind of important to envision it in that way. Um, right. And then um, it's this is a common thing that's happened with not only in Washington, D.C., but also across the country. And that is that the homeowning community was destroyed in 1947, 1944. Let me see, what slide is that? Let me just take a quick look. That is actually some of the older housing right there. So it's a little out of order. Um, but public housing was built in place of that Black home ownership community. Over 400 units of housing were built. And, for the record, this is the Berry Farm that comes to dominate our imaginations and dominate our conversations in Washington, D.C. The public housing piece, right? We didn't learn about the connection between Reconstruction and the Black home ownership community. It's the public housing that kind of dominates our consciousness, particularly for people who didn't live there, and that is very stigmatizing. So this space became very stigmatized, and basically we're talking about the state acting on behalf of white supremacy and on behalf of segregation. The idea being Black and white people cannot live together. This is a racialized space because there were already Black homeowners there. So the idea is these Black homeowners have to make way for the building of the public housing. So again, it's very racialized, and the whole argument was, of course, white people didn't want Black people in their neighborhoods. That said, Black people have a way of making a way out of no way. This was, for context, the post-World War II period. The economy was expanding, and Roosevelt desegregated the federal workforce. So this public housing was actually for people that were government workers and the people that were the families and the children of the military, people who were in the military. Um, and I say that for context because there's going to be a marked transition. But these folks, they, again, before urban renewal, some of the folks that I talk with who are, in their 80s and 90s talked about having some measure of hope because of that political and economic context, right? In comparison with folks in the 70s, 60s, and the 70s and the 80s, where you're seeing more of a contraction economically. These folks were talking about, again, belonging and their social networks and the culture, and they talk about a richness there that that conversation kind of dissipates when we move forward to the 21st century. By the 21st century, you're seeing the cumulative effects of inequality. I'm talking about urban disinvestment, job discrimination. For the record, in Washington, we like to express a bit of pride in the fact that, DC has this Black middle class and has these higher incomes perhaps for Black folks compared to other places. Truth of the matter is, DC has a very racial division of labor. And we also have a lot of class conflict within the Black community. Um, for the racial division of labor, Blacks are predominant in government. African Americans predominate service sector work in the hospitals and in the universities. They also predominate in transit. At one point, Black people couldn't be a bus driver if you were Black in the city. And now, predominant, most Black people, I mean, the bus drivers and folks working in the metro are predominantly African American. The highest paid folks, are white Americans, and this has contributed to tremendous gaps in both income and in wealth. So, that's a part of the context that we're talking about. So, 21st century, you're seeing the ramifications of all that, as well as, housing tenuousness. The war on drugs generated a lot of vulnerability, the budget cuts, mass incarceration. This is the context. This is the social and the economic and the political context in which neglect at Berry Farm occurred, and residents begging for repairs, begging for assistance. I remember going door to door in Berry Farm, talking with people. They have mold, they have holes in the wall, holes in the ceiling, holes in the floor, etc., rats, mice, and all of that, and not getting the proper response, not getting the assistance from the city government. The solution for the government, demolition. Right, that's a story that's been repeated across the country. Empower DC was working with residents. Empower DC has a long relationship with people in Berry Farm, and the residents were mobilizing around this idea of building in place, right, as a workaround to um, displacement. Unfortunately, the larger trend of eradicating public housing was the answer that the residents got. Corey.
Thank you so much for that additional context. I'm going to go back really quickly just to this slide to make a particular note. Um, Berry Farm, when it was cleared back in like 1944 through the use of eminent domain, they did it sort of under the guise of the larger redevelopment in the city that was taking place. So there was a lot of slum clearance going on. And I want to dispel a notion, okay? You all can see these houses. They're not small. They're not shacks. They're not shanty houses. That's a two-story house that was on waterfront property in Southeast Washington, D.C. The problem was the city did not want to bring public works to these areas. And as a result, they were falling apart. And instead of investing in them in a meaningful way, they decided that they would demolish them and build public housing. And it's also important to just to note, as I'm sort of thinking about talking about the work, when Berry Farm was constructed as a public housing community, it was built as an explicitly Black space. It was segregated. And so throughout its history, it has been by choice and by force a racialized space. With that, I want to talk a bit about our work. As Sabiyha sort of mentioned, Empower DC has a long relationship with Berry Farm residents. We began working with them back in like 2011. And at the time, it was, as Sabiyha mentioned, we were trying to organize around a build in place model. Build in place is basically you knock a building down, you relocate the tenants, you rebuild the building, you bring them back, right? You do that to sort of avoid mass disposition and displacement on site. When we approached the city with that option, they said, no, the buildings are falling apart. We need to tear them all down. And that is when residents really got really clear about what they were looking for at that point. It was clear that if we could not save the housing, that at a minimum, we needed to save the history. And so Empower DC pulled together a group of organizers, historians, architects, and began documenting the history of the community. And that is how we were able to work with Alcione Amos, who I think Sabiyha and I would both agree wrote the preeminent source of history on Berry Farm. Um, you know, that book sort of allowed us to provide a lot of the historical context so that we could go to the city and say, hey, you're about to put under the bulldozer a 150 plus year old African American community with no consideration as to what's historically significant, what's important as it relates to the history of Black placemaking in the city. Berry Farm precedes a lot of the neighborhoods in the city. It's 1867. It's one of the oldest communities in the city. And so we pulled together all these folks and we went to the Historic Preservation Review Board, submitted a historic nomination for 35 buildings. We were unsuccessful in getting 35. We did get 5. There are 5 buildings that are still left of the community that was built in 1944 on this land that was a part of the larger 375-acre community of landowners. And so for 74 years, we had land ownership at Berry Farm, and that was interrupted to build public housing. And in 2019, after a series of policies of neglect and divestment, Berry Farm as a public housing project fell apart. And once again, the city made a decision to step in and interrupt that element of Black placemaking, to make no mention of issues like the war on drugs, Iran-Contra, et cetera, and the role of drugs in Black communities in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. Also feels like a bit of an injustice, right? These communities don't just fall apart in a vacuum. They fall apart because the government creates a circumstance in which they can justify the demolition of Black spaces. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Prince to talk a bit about the documentary, and then I'll be back with you all in a little bit.
So the arts, Berry Farm Community Land and Justice. The arts have been really important for us in pushing this story forward. Um, not only the history, but also the contemporary battle around the right to return. And doing this organizing work, of course, we always learn it's about relationships, right? I mean, I've learned that from my mentors, and I've learned that through doing. And it's through relationships that I have the honor to co-direct this documentary. And that's one of the advertisements that we used for it with Samuel George of the Bertelsmann Foundation. And this film does a few different things for our work, I think. For one, it's just a really tangible tool for advocacy. The powers that be cannot ignore the value of this place and the people in the history, and they actually have tried to do so. That was an experience that we had doing this work. We were told that this was not a historic site, and now with the film, no one can deny that. So it's really helps to augment the work around the landmark designation. I mean, basically, it's a testimonial, right? And it becomes a huge part of our fight, letting people know, hey, this is what's going on. Um, as such, it also helps us to build coalitions, which is more than telling a story. It's a part of the whole work there. You need partners, you need co-advocates. We have screened this film, which is now an award-winning film in tons of libraries all across Washington, D.C., community centers. I've screened it to audiences as small as 5 people, as large as 300 people. We've talked to staff at law firms, at HUD, Housing and Urban Development, the Public Defender's Office, the Attorney General's Office, high schools, colleges. We also got grant money to hire a stations relations advocate, and they helped us to get the film syndicated. So it's been shown all over the country in 27 top television markets in public television. So it's been really powerful for that. And, filmmaking is a team effort. It's not about one person. It's not just about the directors. It's about everybody kind of working together. And I think collectively, we've been able to really push this story. And I guess finally, it also brings some beauty into the process. In addition to, doing the work of highlighting the history, uplifting, amplifying, if you will, the voices of folks from that community, just bringing some beauty and some joy into the process and thinking about other ways to fight, thinking about unique ways to pool our resources and get the story told.
So we're coming up on close. I want to be really, really sort of brief, but I also want to tell you all the story. And so if I can, I'm going to ask y'all, if you feel so comfortable, you can close your eyes because it's going to be funny. And I just want y'all to be ready for it. So there's a story that takes place in the film. Sabiyha knows what I'm about to tell. There's a woman sitting on a porch and she starts recounting things that her father used to do. And she recalls how they used to go down to the river and fish all the time. And that they would come back home with carp so large that the tails would be dragging across the ground. And she says, and I quote, when my mother finished with that fish, it tasted like pork chop. We're still trying to figure out how you do that. Okay. So I say that to say, this was a self sufficient community. Okay. They had access to a river as an economic engine. They had shops, barbershops, all sorts of things. This was a self sufficient community, self contained. They didn't need to go to the neighboring Anacostia, which was a segregated white space. They could do everything right there. And so, as we're sort of thinking about what to do today with the 5 buildings we have, I do want to take a moment just to sort of share with you a little bit of the vision that we've been able to pull together and then sort of give you the cannon fodder to ask us questions later. With that, this is a rendering of a potential future for the site. What we're talking about is you can see some community garden space down here in the bottom corner, concert venue up here. You can see some outdoor wellness space, right? We're envisioning a place where the community, whether it's residents that are in place or the residents that we're hoping are able to return to Berry Farm, can engage in not just learning the history, right? Because it seems like a disservice to turn the homes of residents into a museum. There's going to be space here for small business incubation. There will be space here for community wellness, and we're looking at that in a holistic sense, right? The wellness of the mind, the body, and the spirit, um, and then trying to enrich the community with the opportunities that they've been robbed of over the course of 150 years. With that, I do want to share that like the one of sort of the things I'm super excited about is the entrepreneurship hub. Um, there's co-working space here. There's micro enterprise space here. I like to think about it as like, y'all know the folks on Instagram making bracelets. I want them people here, right? I want the people that are actively doing things to enrich themselves to have space where they can come together, convene, and be communally together, working towards a common end of enriching the community. And with that, if you feel so inclined, you can scan that QR code, and that'll take you to the Berry Farm film that y'all can watch later. It's a wonderful film. I watch it all the time, by choice and by force. And so, want to just welcome y'all to do that, and we welcome questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Kwame Edwin Otu, who is Georgetown's 2024 Faculty of the Year. Congratulations, Dr. Otu. He is an associate professor in the African Studies program at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. He is a cultural anthropologist who studies the politics of sexual, environmental, and technological citizenships, public health, and those intersections with shifting racial formations in neocolonial and neoliberal Africa and the African diaspora. His first book, Amphibious Subjects, Sasso and the Contested Politics of Queer Self-Making in Neoliberal Ghana, is an ethnography on queer self-fashioning among a community of self-identified, effeminate men known in local parlance as Sasso. Professor Otu will speak today from his current and ongoing project, which investigates the global politics of e-waste in particular, and the undulations of global environmental transitions in general, and their impacts on African and African-descended bodies.
Good morning. It's still morning, right? Sorry. It's really such a joy to be here, to be in my own backyard, as I would say, to share my work. And Dr. Harrison, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Dr. Rudds, for the wonderful introduction. And thank you all. This is such an incredible project. It's good to see Corey. Just let yourself enjoy this project. I can see the passion. And Dr. Prince, it's nice to see a cultural anthropologist, in the house, and especially in the Washington, D.C. area too. So I'll definitely be in touch. Today, what I'm going to be talking about, sorry. Okay. So I'm going to be sharing a snippet of a chapter from my ongoing project. And it's part of the book entitled tentatively The Salvage Slot, Technology in the Ecologies of the Afterlife. I am an anthropologist, as Dr. Ross rightfully said, and I've become increasingly interested in waste politics and how waste politics affects Africans on the continent and of course elsewhere. Ghana currently has the world's largest electronic waste dump, right? And I'm interested in the ways in which why is Ghana or why does Africa emerge as a site of extraction and deposition, right? And so the presentation I'm going to be giving today takes seriously the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 as a critical juncture in the history of world making, right? That really raptures or legitimizes, if you will, the fact that Africa becomes a site for deposition, right? And I'm doing this as an anthropologist because I've also realized that in spite of anthropology's complicity or the role it played in the production of the discourses and the kinds of vocabularies that legitimize Africa's place in the global imaginary, right? That anthropologists haven't really taken seriously the impacts of the Berlin Conference. They've left that task to historians mostly. So in many ways, this is my way of hoping to invite anthropologists to take this seriously, right? And so the title of the paper is Civilization as Extraction. And I'm really interested in the ways in which civilization really unmade, the African continent and Black people everywhere. And then if we are thinking about Black futurity and placemaking, right? How are we, or how should we contend with these histories in order not to rehearse the kinds of, commodification, the fact that, the relationships we have to land, to the environment, like how do we ensure that we do not rehearse these civilizing incursions that, dehumanized us. The Martinican anti-colonial thinker Amy Césaire felicitously condemns the irrationality of European colonizing missions under the rubric of civilization, intimating that these projects exposed the darkness in the heart of Europe, declaring unapologetically that, quote, Europe is indefensible. Césaire, with unwavering passion, summons us to, quote, study how colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism, end of quote. Césaire is not the only anti-colonial figure to share in this view. In Senegal, Césaire's contemporary, the historical anthropologist Cheikh Anta Diop, makes a related provocation. In his book, Civilization or Barbarism, Diop, with metaphorical verve, illuminates how, and I quote, imperialism, like the prehistoric hunter, first killed the being spiritually and culturally, before trying to eliminate it physically. The negation of the intellectual accomplishments of Black Africans was cultural and mental murder, which preceded and paved the way for their genocide here and there in the world, end of quote. From the small Antillean island of Martinique to Senegal, these two thinkers together offer introspective perspectives on the invidiousness of Western civilizing crusades, coordinated both in Africa and the so-called New World. I examine the enigmatic position anthropology occupied in the historical context in which these crusades unfolded, the late 19th to early 20th centuries. This is a period that, according to Norbert Elias, the German sociologist, and I quote, witnessed the full flowering of the civilizing process, that is, the acceptance of an ethos that attached great importance to the control of self-indulgent impulses, end of quote. Thus, as a discipline of culture, then perceived as the antidote to those self-indulgent impulses, anthropology fertilized the geographies of the Western imagination in which the other was constituted. These imaginaries not only nourished the context in which the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 unfolded, but also anthropology's preoccupation with the savage, proclaiming that the savage needed saving lest they go extinct. Anthropology produced a vast body of knowledges, both mainstream and marginal. These knowledges, even when they recognized that the savage was just as cultured like the European, produced taxonomies and classifications that elevated Europeans as superior to Africans. For example, imperialist Cecil Rhodes invokes this superiority in his will when he states that, and I quote, we are the first race in the world, and this is in reference to the white race. And the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. I contend that every acre added to a territory means the birth of more of the English race who otherwise would not be brought into existence, end of quote. Rhodes' statement here is not made in a vacuum. Indeed, it forms a backdrop that the Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Trouillot has described as the geography of imagination that produced the field of anthropology. In his essay entitled Anthropology and the Savage Slot, Trouillot argues that disciplinary anthropology emerged in a discursive context that, quote, did not address anthropology's relationship to the geography of imagination of the West, nor did it question the savage slot, end of quote. Does he invite us to interrogate anthropology because anthropology refused to historicize the larger discursive field that produced it? Relatedly, the Anglo-Zimbabwean anthropologist Peter Rigby maintains that although, and I quote, anthropologists rightly pride themselves on their ability to analyze, understand, and explain mythological and symbolic systems, yet they seldom address those associated with the provenance of their own discipline and the political economy and culture of its own gestation and development, end of quote. I aver in this presentation that the Berlin Conference of 1884-85 exemplifies this provenance. There, assumptions circulating about Africa and its people as in need of Christianity, commerce, and civilization reinforced anthropology's disciplinary relevance as a science of man and culture. Although the Berlin Conference is of interest to me here, I've chosen to pay attention, out of respect for time, to a provision from the General Act implemented at the conference. This is the conference. Although the Berlin Conference is of interest to me here, I've chosen to pay attention, out of respect for time, to a provision from the General Act implemented at the conference and the Brazza Makoko affair, a treaty that will further fuel the chaos caused by Europe's extractive affairs in Africa. Orchestrated by Germany's first Chancellor Otto von Bismarck on the request of King Leopold II of Belgium and the leaders of Portugal, the conference brought together representatives from 14 nations, namely Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, the Ottoman Empire, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Norway, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Organized with the intent to avoid a European conflagration in Africa, the conference was held without any African presence. At the conference, a general act was passed with provisions that effectively legitimized settler and exploitative colonialism. Provision 6 of the General Act is replete with anthropological references. In one section, signatories are tasked with the responsibility to, quote, preserve native tribes while caring for the improvement of their conditions and their moral and material well-being. And in the provisions invocation that all religious, scientific, or charitable institutions and undertakings created and organized for the above ends, or which aim at instructing the natives and bringing home to them the blessings of civilization, we see yet again the deployment of anthropological lexicon. The institutions referenced here comprised, and I quote, Christian missionaries, scientists, and explorers with their followers, property, and collections, which, as claimed in the Act, were offered a special protection for being agents of the civilizing mission. It can be argued that anthropologists were in this cohort of scientists and explorers whose sole purpose was to serve as purveyors of the blessings of civilization. A civilization with the intent to expedite the extractive projects that exhausted Africa, anthropological knowledge of Africans, it goes without saying, was present in the pursuit of the treaties signed between Africans and Europeans. The Brazza Makoko Treaty and events leading up to it between 1882 and 1883 exemplify incidents anticipating the organization of the conference in 1884. As the Anglo-Irish historian Thomas Pakenham observes in his book, The Scramble for Africa, on a ship steaming back to Britain called Corisco was, and I quote, a return cargo of pungent tropical goods, barrels of palm oil, bales of gum and rubber, and tusks of ivory. One of the ship's captains was a 30-year-old man of Italo-Franco nobility named Pierre Savognin de Brazza, who had been exploring the regions of Gabon and northern Congo. Brazza came with a story about having made a treaty with an African king called Makoko, who claimed to control the river Congo. For Pakenham, this treaty Brazza claims to have made with or signed with Makoko gave, and I quote, France the gateway to the heart of Africa and to tens and thousands of square miles of fertile soil, only waiting for peaceful exploitation, end of quote. If Brazza opened Africa up to France, as Pakenham notes, then Henry Morton Stanley opened it up for King Leopold II of Belgium. But both Brazza and Stanley were engaged in a duel for the pool. So now I show this image here to show you this deltaic formation, right? So there's a Stanley, it's called the Malibu Pool. But Stanley, right? So Morton Stanley and Brazza are all racing to get to the pool. So whoever gets there first pitches the flag for either Belgium or France, right? And what is very interesting is that they both get there around the same time, but Stanley's on the other side and Brazza is on the other side of the river. So the river, the bank of the Congo from this direction, the Livingston Falls is right there, and then the river Congo is south. Brazzaville is named after Brazza, right? Leopoldville is named after Leopold, right? So the fact that these areas are renamed after these figures is something I'll be speaking to in another section of this paper. Known as the Pool Malibu or Stanley Pool, depending on whether one had allegiance to France or Brazza, or Belgium, or Stanley and Leopold, the quest for the pool tectonically shifts the politics of colonial expropriation. With the Congo River Basin the stage on which these factions unfolded, what would have been Africa's destiny, including its ecological futures, I argue, was undermined. Events such as the Brazza-Makoko Treaty constitute the background against which the Berlin Conference was organized, opening the arteries of the Congo to figures like King Leopold II of Belgium, exacerbating the exploitation of Africans in Africa. These events also provided the context that earmarked for the imperialist Rhodes, an Africa that was on the verge of Anglicization, dubbed the Rhodes Colossus Project, right? So Rhodes really had this vision to have Africa under British occupation, right? So he calls it the Rhodes Colossus Project, right? It emblematizes this magisterial vision to connect Cairo to Cape Town via rail in the hope to effectively complete British colonization of Africa. Now, I want to quickly return to Amy Césaire and Sheikh Anta Diop's provocations on which barbarism at the heart of European civilizing forays is made clear. In particular, to Diop's assertion that, quote, imperialism, like the prehistoric hunter, first killed the being spiritually and culturally before trying to eliminate it physically. To reframe this process of elimination to which Diop draws our attention, I have become very fascinated in the idea of terraforming, right? Which, of course, is very commonly used in, people who do exploration of other planetary, elements, right? And in sci-fi too. To reframe this process of elimination to which Diop draws our attention, I use terraforming, whether through slow or expeditious violence, as a literal and geological device to unpack the ideological and material advances made by colonization. Terraforming, which loosely means earth shaping, is used here to explain how colonial forays deformed African bodies and their environments by shaping them to fan European fluorescence. On ideological and spiritual levels, terraforming through infrastructures of knowledge production, including anthropology, transformed Africans' relations with their environment by sucking them into the vortex of the violently extractive enterprises of European powers. The destructive force of this can be seen in how Europeans came to have dehumanizing views of Africans and their environments, which is now also rehearsed by how Africans, in their views of themselves and their environments, dehumanize themselves. On material and physical levels, the Berlin Conference is an auspicious event that accelerates this process of terraforming in Africa. There, the anthropological knowledges of the savage slot, seen in descriptions of Africa as terra nullius, the heart of darkness, empty landscapes, and in need of blessings of civilization, is put to use. Using terraforming as a device to describe the colonial ideological and material transformations in Africa allows me to show how the Berlin Conference unfolded, drawing on the intellectual oxygen ventilated by anthropology. The conference was the venue at which the links between ideological and material terraforming solidified, marking the entry of Africa and its peoples into a global racial capitalist system already terraforming the globe. The environmental rearrangement, or the F-shaping processes initiated at the Berlin Conference, shaped Africa's ecological futures. And this, I conclude, is evidenced by the continent's emergence as paradoxically a site of extraction and deposition, something that I think Walter Rodney really quite document. So here on the screen, I'm interested in this particular chapter of the book, the ways in which we need to reverse Enlightenment thinking, right? That in many ways, enlightening the dark continent reveals, as the likes of Césaire and Diop reveal, the darkness in the heart of Europe, right? And so figures like Cecil Rhodes and Leopold, I think they have left the models for us already. I mean, we live in a world right now where we are witnessing whatever is happening in the Congo, right? With the extractive, like the afterlives of these histories. But even in places like the Middle East, the Palestine situation, I'm trying to invite us to think about the ways in which these figures are still living with us today, right? I mean, you can look at DC. You were talking about, uh, this neighborhood, right? The Barry Farm project, like the ways in which the city intervenes, the city's interruption, what histories are being interrupted, or what futures are being interrupted, right? And I am also trying to think about the ways in which the Berlin Conference, and I was having this conversation with my colleague, Professor Somotan, really somehow conceives the model on which an organization like the UN is built, right? Because the Berlin Conference, by assembling 14 nations, which was the first time in history that, nations were assembled, right? And the conveyance, or the convening, I beg your pardon, of this conference is because of Africa, right? And it's happening in Berlin, which would eventually become the hat for the orchestration of Nazism. So a lot of these international organizations, and because I teach at Georgetown, I try to, and I'm in the School of Foreign Service in particular, I try to challenge my students to think about the genesis, the etymology of the origins of these organizations, right? That the Berlin Conference is really giving us a model of what will become the League of Nations, which would then become the UN, right? That in fact, the UN's genesis is actually at the Berlin Conference, right? And against the backdrop, and Africa is the backdrop for the Berlin Conference, right? So it's just an invitation for us to think about the ways in which these terraforming missions continue to unfold and reproduce themselves using these big organizations and through all these projects. So I'm really looking forward to thinking with you during the question time, and thank you for being here.
Our last speaker today for this panel is Dr. LaToya Eaves. Professor Eaves is Associate Professor of Geography and Sustainability at the University of Tennessee, a proud North Carolinian. Her research is informed by her Southern upbringing, focusing on power and place by examining social and political inequalities through Black, queer, and feminist geography frameworks. Eaves has published extensively, including in Southeastern Geographer and Gender, Place, and Culture. She is co-editor of the recently published Spatial Futures, Difference in the Post-Anthropocene, and she is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Ronald F. Abler Distinguished Service Honor from the American Association of Geographers. Please help me welcome Dr.
Morning. Thank you to Amani and Lydia and everyone involved with convening this really wonderful event. I'm very honored to be here and to be in conversation with all of you. So what I have to talk about today has a lot to do. It's sort of a convergence of about 4 projects that I'm working on. So hopefully it makes sense by the end. And then I look forward to having a conversation with you in the Q&A. So the sort of origins of the title of my talk, which is Black Women's Reclamation Power at the End of the World, has to do with the emergence of Black geographies as a subfield in the discipline of geography, which has its roots over the last century, but really has gained some traction in the last 10 years through institutionalization of different kinds, including in geography and then also in conversation across disciplines and places and times. We, in Spatial Futures book, which is the photo is here on the screen, the cover features an image from Torkwase Dyson, Torkwase Dyson, looking for the people in the creek. If you're familiar with Dyson's work, she uses spatial networks as part of, as a central part of how she produces work, thinking through water and bodies and architecture and places. So thankful to Torkwase for including our, down. Okay. Do I need to start over? Okay. All right. So so thankful to Dyson for letting us use her image. And in this book, we talk about the significance of Black geographies as a political project that concerns and centers and amplifies Black epistemologies and ontologies, drawing attention to the conditions under which Black people make place and engage space. Such a project diverges from what has been around in geography a while, the geographies of race, like the measurement of race in place. And that's a conversation that's been brought out recently in a paper produced by Adam Bledsoe and Willie Wright and some others in one of our flagship journals in geography. That geography of race has its limitations because it only centers, or that the way that it has been taking up centers practices of anti-Blackness through colonization, displacement, dispossession, eraser, and epistemicide. And so we work against, in Black geographies, those conceptual linkages that produce monolithic knowledges about Blackness and reducing Blackness to enclosures and containers. So some of the people who have been doing that work and who are represented in the book are those who think about Black agrarianism, like Priscilla McCutcheon, those who think about maroon geographies across America, like Celeste, who's here, and Adam Bledsoe and Alex Moulton, those who think about negotiating the plantation's afterlives, Danielle Purifoy, who is around but not here today, not here this morning, and Tiana Bruno, political activities across Europe, like through Camilla Hawthorne talks about, and To Respite and Joy, which Doug Allen talks about. And then central to that book, to the book again, is how we use Black geographies to understand spatial futures as insinuated throughout a project or a text rather than just as a discursive central point. And to that end, been thinking about Black placemaking in America as being entangled with empire. And one of the ways that we've looked at how to trace the shifting forms of how Black placemaking happens is to think about different forms of cultural expression. So in thinking about, to bring up the UN again, the 2013 resolution to declare the International Decade for People of African Descent, that proclamation said to further underline the important contribution made by people of African descent to our societies and to propose concrete measures to promote their full inclusion and to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. That proclamation follows the 2011 International Year of People of African Descent. Understanding, made from the decision of the UN to recognize the atrocities that African descended people have and continue to face provides an opportunity to engage with world endings, is what we sort of share in the book. And we also highlight that importantly, Black people have long imagined new worlds. While hegemonic archives have failed to account for Black world visioning, we can rely on Black cultural expressions and traditions of explanation to explore these ideas further. Among these include Black faith traditions, and thinking particularly about the syncretic way that Christianity was developed among Black communities in the US, and merging a number of different traditional practices. Black faith traditions reckon with how to navigate the world, much of which is rooted in the struggle created by anti-Blackness with globalization. Even more, these traditions have rendered futures, constructed lands through discourses of heavens, other worlds, and next lives. World-renowned gospel singer Clara Ward composed the hymn "How I Got Over," which was popularized by Mahalia Jackson later, in which she described reflections of an experience of struggle and where she found strength. So How I Got Over is here on the screen. How I got over, how I got over. You know, my soul looked back and wonder how I got over. And later in the song, it says, I'm gonna sing somewhere around the altar. Oh yes, I'm gonna shout all my troubles over. Lord, I got to thank you. Thank you for being so good to me. Mahalia Jackson reimagined the song as referring to New Jerusalem, which was a different sort of perspective. And this description of how these new worlds would look and feel were important to Clara Ward and Mahalia Jackson, but are also important and provide opportunity to think through Black views of the anthropogenic world, in which we sort of engage with our built and natural environments. And of course, in the book that we talk about, but of course we all know that we are living in a time in which the built and natural environments are so because human activities have come and done so many things in the times before us, has been so discussed so deeply this morning. And it gives us a way to look at things like imperialism and global domination and racial capitalism through the enforcement of global hierarchies and inequalities through race and gender and class and sexualities, as well as land, labor, and capital, again, to be in conversation with the panelists here. Of course, Ruth Wilson Gilmore tells us that inequality requires capitalism and racism enshrines it. In her definition of racism, the state sanctioned or extra legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death in distinct yet densely interconnected political geographies is powerful. Indeed, our built and natural environments have resulted in the exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And so if that's the case, and if we think about how the systems of exploitation and domination are embedded in our built and natural environments, what does it mean for imagining new spatial futures? What does it mean to make new worlds at the end of current worlds? And so we, in this book, took up a lot of ways, including theoretical frameworks beyond Black geographies, thinking with Black ecologies, thinking with the Black outdoors, investigating and thinking about indigenous ways of knowing, which connects to what the panel last night that Rosemary talked about, thinking alongside indigenous thinking, but also thinking about Black indigeneity. That also echoes the work of Clyde Woods, whose work, particularly on the Mississippi Delta, is particularly, is just, I don't know, Clyde Woods is like my patron saint. So I I have a lot to say about Clyde Woods, our ancestor. So to switch out of that, some of the thinking, the book is like very long. It's 550 pages, 16. It took like, it's 16 chapters. There are people from all over the world, including people who were present at a Scandinavian geography conference who are thinking through different sort of landscapes, like the Great Dismal Swamp, who are thinking about sci-fi, who are thinking about the role of gender and queerness in how to imagine a future, and using Black geographies as part of that framework, that overarching framework. And so this brings me to talking about like being connected to thinking about the future has me also in relationship with my own like sort of individual work. And one of my projects is a book about Southern Black feminist geographies that at some point I will finish. But the book is framed under these sort of the tenets that I have here on the screen, thinking about Black women in defense of their lives, thinking about that the methods of Black women in placemaking involve forging communal visions, and that their perspective on socio-spatial liberation is as a work of solidarity and as in the work of dismantling power. In the book, I have several different sort of themes. I open with thinking about Black girlhood, and I also take up questions of labor, activism, faith, and healing, all infused with land and place, land and place-based knowledges infused throughout to again go back to what we took up in Spatial Futures as an infusion throughout the project and not just as a discursive center point. So there are a lot of key moments in the book that, as it is being drafted, that are as what we were told this morning, to look back into history to know how to move towards a future, and thinking alongside people like Fannie Lou Hamer, of course, and Septima Clark takes up a lot of space in my book, and Ida B. Wells Barnett, among others. So while I'm trying to figure out and wrestle with finishing a book about Southern Black feminist geographies, I'm moving into a new set of work that I think builds on Black women's intellectual traditions. And that project is tentatively titled The Afterlives of Deindustrialization in the South, in the US South. And part of what I do there, or what I'm starting to take up, is thinking about thinking more deeply about the South in conversation about globalization, but specifically around Black women's stories linked to that have a lot to do with labor, but not exclusively around labor, that have to do with the lineages of regional formations of the American South. And the South as a region is very prominent in most of my work. And so it continues to be an organizing kind of conversation there. And I include some micro regions as part of that, which I'll show you here in a second. And the other piece to the project is thinking about the complexities of inequalities spurred by industrialization, its decline, and the effects of that decline. And as part of my like sort of regional ideas, I think about the work, the organizing framework for Southerners on New Ground, which was referenced in my dissertation, which is now a 10-year-old document. But part of their organizing framework is about redemption. And in it, they say that because we believe that while the South is a physical geography of white supremacy and poverty, how they form plantations, mountaintop removal, and slave labor, it is more than that. It is a place of redemption and hope for many, a place where folk reconcile with the past in an honest and painful way, a place where people can stay in lands riddled with pain and remember old traditions and birth new ways. So to that end, this deindustrialization project it has two sort of sub-regions within the South. Well, a lot of my work takes place in North Carolina, but Tennessee is inching in just because I've lived in Tennessee almost 10 years now. And particularly because of events of the last 2 weeks, which I'll explain in a moment, around the hurricane. But I'm focusing on two different parts of North Carolina, which also have bleed overs into the states that surround it. So Southern Virginia to the east in Eastern North Carolina, and then upstate South Carolina in Western North Carolina. I chose these two different sites because they have very interesting and complex stories around how Blackness gets framed, with Eastern North Carolina being where a massive amount of the plantation agricultural system of North Carolina, its empire with cotton and tobacco, takes place. And then in Western North Carolina, where some of those materials get funneled and put into textile mills and produced and sent out into the world. And they have overlaps because of just like, because political boundaries are just arbitrary lines that somebody drew one day. And, you know, so like all of my grandparents were born in South Carolina. If you see the word Spartanburg, which is, you know, in this left circle, that's also includes Charlotte to the right of that circle, you know, like that's my family, like, you know, land where they've been for a very long time. And so they just naturally kind of bleed over into across state boundaries. The projects are, I had originally thought like very, very big about including tobacco production and cotton, and like I wanted to include every industry that made like North Carolina an empire of the world, and that became really kind of cumbersome. So I focused in on textiles and the cotton industry. And the reason too about, let me go back. The reason too about the Eastern North Carolina section is it includes the J.P. Stevens plant that had a lot of labor movement situations happening in the second half of the 20th century with factory workers. There's also Warren County, which I talk about in a piece with Danielle, actually, that came out in Southeastern Geographer, honoring the life of Bobby Wilson, who's a geographer who died a couple of years ago. But Warren County, North Carolina, is considered the birthplace of the environmental justice movement. And so like all of these like kind of pieces overlap. Also in Warren County is the old site, or what was to be Soul City, Floyd McKissick's planned Black town that was sort of disrupted before it could even get started because white supremacy. And one of the company buildings that was supposed to be like a factory for Old City is currently the Warren Correctional Institution. So it's like Plan Black Town that's supposed to be like this egalitarian like place where Black people are honored and dignified is now houses incarcerated men. That's an interesting kind of psychic thing to sit with. But in any case, so that gives us two different kind of contexts for understanding the South and the relationship of globalization to this like sort of kind of moving outward in all of these kinds of ways. The image here on the screen is part of an exhibit about thinking about cotton in the Carolina foothills. So the western part, which includes my hometown, is is at the intersection of North Carolina's Piedmont and Appalachia, so it like has some overlaps there. And this is from the Earl Scruggs Center. Earl Scruggs, famous musician who is also from my hometown, spent some time in a cotton factory as he was working on his banjo, and then eventually moved to Nashville. So there's an effort to include the history of the banjo as an African instrument brought into the Carolinas and into what we now call the United States, as well as Appalachia, alongside the cotton industry, which I think is surprised me because I didn't know my hometown was that forward thinking. But in any case, part of that project lends itself to understanding how Black women's labor geographies can inform the work differently as we imagine sort of this like future and wrestle with what comes out of industrial decline. So the question I have here, how can understanding Black women's geographies shift our analyses of the structural dynamics of Southern economies, regional transformations, and globalization? Or if I can use Ruth Wilson Gilmore's question, who then was or is out of place? So some of this work is embedded in, like I've done some preliminary work as I like move towards a grant proposal and, you know, trying to get some publications out and having lots of conversations in parts of North Carolina over the last year and a half or so, spending time in archival research, talking to politicians, elected officials, organization leaders, most importantly, former mill workers in these sites across the state. They've given some insights that have been interesting to kind of wrestle with, and thinking about how the conditions of work, and thinking about in the past, like the kind of labor and health outcomes that happen when you desegregate a work environment. And so one of the two women who desegregated one of the plants in Eastern North Carolina is still living. She's 91 years old this year. And her daughter had a conversation with me and talked about her mother not being able to drink out of the water fountain in the cotton mill and having to go outside to use the bathroom because the facilities were desegregated, and getting these insights into labor organization of that time, and thinking about the sort of long-term consequences of being held in environmental conditions that are create different kinds of vulnerability that might not be expected. One of the things about mill work, and I think manufacturing work and so many other things, is that it at one point is like, you know, the economic engine of any particular place in the South, and is also considered the good job. That's what people do. You like grow up, you go work at the mill, you get a pension at the end, and then you come home and you like, you know, have your children and like do this like social reproduction kind of thing. But then there's like, what happens when you do the good job for so long, and then you're supposed to go into retirement, you get your pension. One of the last people to get their pension is someone who worked in a plant. Actually, this is a conversation of a person that worked in a couple of different mills, who had a friend who worked in the paper plant, who the North Carolina forestry industry, you know, is extremely extractive. But, you know, we have the Christmas tree industry in Western North Carolina, which will be an interesting conversation here soon. But then we also have the paper mills that are still in high production. So the person, as you can see on the quote on the screen, retired in December one year. She had been at the factory about 30 years. She worked in the lab, which was considered a clean job. She was around chemicals and testing all of the pulp and the paper as it came out as it was processed through the factory. This person says, I'll let you know, as soon as she retired, probably about 2 months later, they found a brain tumor. Said it was linked to all those chemicals, breathing in all those chemicals, you know, and being down there in a paper mill. As soon as she retired, she got that brain tumor, and I'd say probably within 5 or 6 months after that, after she was diagnosed, she was gone. She died, and she was my age. And I'll be 63 in May. That was the person I interviewed in February 2023. Premature death, right? And then thinking about like all of the kinds of what does it mean to continue life and think about a future when the good job is gone and you've endured all of these other kinds of health issues as well around brown lung and brown lung in particular had impacted Black people in different textile mills across the state. And so this person reiterated this in my interview with them, to think about like how disruptive brown lung was to Black families, and to thinking about, you know, like multiple people in a family having different forms of brown lung as well as cancers and those kinds of things, and thinking about the intersections of that with poverty and trying to like think about what to do next. And then so in its decline and sort of the ways of trying to understand place after the mills close, thinking about like what it means to like revitalize an area. Both of the regions that I like showed you on the map are having very different kind of conversations, which are interesting. But the one in Eastern North Carolina is particularly struggling because the sort of rural, I think there's some impacts around rurality, as well as like there are projects that are sort of put forward and then reduced and then put forward and then reduced. And this particular person said that if there was just sort of one industry that would come in and, you know, like be that sort of economic center, that it would make a world difference. You know, the shopping mall has declined, the factories are gone. Like, what do we do now? And people still need to provide for their families. And she said that when the mills left, they closed and stuff, it left such a bad taste in people's minds and mouths, which is, while this interview is from Eastern North Carolina, was also reflected in conversations I've had in Western North Carolina that I'm like working through to try to figure out the best ways to like capture that in conversation with the community. And so all of these things, that's like three different projects that I've been working through, but I can't like leave this conversation without talking about Helene, because it happened in my backyard. I live over the mountain in East Tennessee. And so a couple of things. So this map here is showing road closures throughout Western North Carolina, which are impacting how people maneuver around. And one of the things that I think is important to re-emphasize is that there are Black people in the Appalachian Mountains, and they live lives in a number of different ways. 45 minutes from my hometown is the childhood home of Nina Simone. Nina Simone was in Tryon, North Carolina, and then she went to school in Asheville, North Carolina. Like there's a long history of like Black folks out there. So the 2 weeks, you know, after Helene hit North Carolina, we're looking at major disruptions to a number of things, but particularly about like trying to reimagine how we move forward in life. North Carolina is very good about, Western North Carolina in particular has a lot of like cooperative networks, people who are deeply embedded in mutual aid, who have been thinking about living wage and labor conditions for a long time, who've been trying to focus on the queer homeless youth who come from other parts of North Carolina to the North Carolina mountains because it's seen as a haven for them, and so many other things. And this is like, so this vastly disruptive in so many different kinds of ways. There are two things I want to mention though that I am trying to look forward to and thinking about varying levels of impacts on Black placemaking in particular. One of them is through the urgency around which the manufacturing sites around Eastern Tennessee and Western North Carolina are being put back into place. So you might have heard a story about Spruce Pine, North Carolina, which is a town of about 2,000 people. There are literally 16 Black people, according to census numbers. But it is also home to the purest quartz in the world, which is a key ingredient of all of our cell phones and our computers and our medical equipment, and so many other things. And just yesterday, while people are still like trying to like figure out where their homes can come from because of like the floods and the rain like washed people's homes away and whole towns away, the mines are open and producing again because of the urgency of the global market, and capitalism. Again, capitalism requires inequality, to quote Gilmore. The other piece that I think is important to think about here is related to infrastructure. So I talk about road closings. I have this map of the road closings right now. If I pulled the power map, it would also be like there are a lot of people still without electricity and livelihoods. But impacting this portion of the state as well is the interstate system. And Interstate 40 runs from North Carolina to California for 2,554 miles, nearly 450 miles of which is in Tennessee and about the same in North Carolina. Part of Interstate 40 is in a very kind of isolated area between North Carolina and Tennessee, just sort of weaving through the mountains. I'm about done, I promise. And the interstate at that point runs alongside the Pigeon River, and the Pigeon River decided it was coming for its land again. So part of the interstate has fallen into the river, and North Carolina and Tennessee border is closed for about 43 miles along the interstate, which is the most direct route from the eastern ports into the inland U.S. and so many other things. And so to think about the history of the interstate system as essential to like interconnecting this is important too. I live in Tennessee, which is home to Al Gore Sr. and Al Gore Jr. But Al Gore Sr., of course, was a U.S. senator as well, who, along with George Fallon of Maryland, introduced the Fallon-Gore Act of 1956, which was the national system of interstate and defense highways. And so one of the things that is interesting is thinking about where the interstates sort of take place and how those lands are deciding they want to be reclaimed in a kind of psychic level, which has some impact on a lot of the current conditions that like have produced Black people's lives and Black placemaking across the U.S. So at that point, I'm done. And I'd like to thank you for your time.
Well, thank you again to our panelists. We can give them another round of applause. I've been informed that because we started a few minutes late that we can go over just a little bit. So we will get you out to lunch, but we want to provide, plenty of time for questions and engagement. I just wanted to synthesize what you've helped me to think about through your talk. You shared a lot about origin stories for land, including legacies of ownership and dispossession, and the different ways that these land stories can be either suppressed, as in the case of the discipline of cultural anthropology, or leveraged, as in the case of Empower DC's work and obviously the histories of Black feminism. And I noticed that your work and the visuals that you presented us with today juxtaposed in very close proximity, like the old and new dreams, and the ending and the beginning of worlds, I think was mentioned. And so I hope that we'll be able to talk about these kind of visions of the afterlife, which you kind of encouraged us to think on, kind of maybe more abstract historical or theoretical level, but also in a very, very practical level in terms of labor practices and redevelopment, and the shrinking of space. So, I mean, I actually I kind of wanted to ask maybe one big question and invite folks to ask questions, and then I'll jump in if there are any lags. And maybe Dr. Eaves, because the end of your talk I felt really kind of got into this. Maybe I'll ask our other two panelists to join you in these thoughts. Because, you know, particularly with like Helen and the replacement of this planned town with now a prison, which I found so impactful. It seems like this threat of the obscuration of these histories is ongoing, particularly just from an ecological or natural evolution, right, of climate change, et cetera, in addition to racial capitalism. And I guess I was wondering, Dr. Otu and Corey and Dr. Prince, if you could speak to just kind of the ongoing threat of obscuration in the spaces that you study and manage. I'm thinking about, for example, the way that Africa is kind of presented as, you know, this global space for tourism and investment. I'm thinking about, you know, whether the land around the 5 buildings that you were able to preserve are privatized and what's going to be in those spaces, and just how you were kind of thinking about and maybe planning for those threats that we face now.
There we go. All right. I guess one, I would be remiss if I didn't note that Berry Farm sort of gets its reputation in part from the reputation it garnered, but also from the tenant advocacy that goes on at Berry Farm. And to name the women that sort of created the National Welfare Rights Organization, Etta Horn and Lillian Wright. Etta Horn was the president of the National Welfare Rights Organization. She advised Dr. Martin Luther King on the Poor People's Campaign in Washington. A lot of folks don't realize Dr. King was just going to do like a talented 10th type march in Washington. And it wasn't until Etta Horn basically walked into the room and was like, hey, champ, like the huddled masses of our people need to be brought to the table. And it was Black women that pulled women from across the country together in Washington, D.C., and created this moment in which Dr. King is sort of lauded for. And so just wanted to name that. As it relates to the challenges and the threats that we face right now, the land is owned by the Housing Authority here in DC. The developer has a 99-year ground lease. The property surrounding those 5 buildings will be a mixed income development. That is to say, there will be some units that will be affordable, but they will be in the private market. There will be other units that are market rate and are also in the private market. And so the sort of principal thing that we've been combating against and advocating for is a right to return for residents of Berry Farm. It seems nonsensical that we would have to do that, but unfortunately, that's the nature of the beast, right? We do have to sort of say the thing that makes sense to the masses of us and say, you've displaced these residents unnecessarily. And I guess the other problem we're sort of dealing with is, in addition to sort of advocating for a right to return, is that it's taking so long to rebuild this housing. The demolition and everything took place in 2019. It's 2024 and there's one building. Just to be clear, there were 440 units on this property. They've got one building with 77 units up right now. That's it. And so there, I think on 2 prongs, you know, there's the right to return and then the need to try and find a way equitably and reasonably to increase the speed of development so that we're not talking about townhomes for the community being built in 2027 and then, you know, a majority of the residents who were seniors no longer with us, right? They've gone to join the ancestors. So it's a real and immediate threat we're trying to sort of navigate.
And also, thank you, Corey. 2 other points about obscuring reality. You mentioned mixed income. I think that's one of the avenues in which this occurs, ignoring the reality of what was there, right? There were mixed income people already there. So these are code words, and these are words that are concepts that are used to displace people and to not see people both in the present and historically. You know, and lumping poor and working class people into some amorphous blob that doesn't speak to the nuances and the complexities and the diversity of their experience. So the place was already mixed income, is my point. right? I mean, there were already people that had very varied income levels, varied lives. And, this whole mixed income thing is just a way to displace people. The whole affordable piece. That's another word that is absolutely meaningless because what we're talking about is not, I mean, there's an area median income that's very high in Washington, D.C. And so the idea of what's affordable actually ends up being very high and ends up leaving working class and lower income people out of the mix. So there's that part. And then lastly, Corey mentioned the building that's up. I don't know if it's completed or what, but it's for elders. Um, and that environment was people of multiple ages, multiple background. So just building housing for elders, we see that as a strategy, particularly when public housing is demolished. That's the first kind of thing that is done. It's important, it's needed. I'm not against that, although it's important to understand that the previous Berry Farm property, or a lot of what was demolished, people lived in townhomes. They had access to green space. They could look out and see their neighbors. And now that's being replaced with towers where people do not have that access. They don't have access to each other, and they also don't have access to some of their kinfolk, particularly their younger folk, being able to live with them or what have you, right? Because that kind of stuff is not allowed in these newer buildings. So there's a lot being obscured. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Oh, perfect. Thank you for very much, Dr. Rose. And I really have been thinking about, this right to return, especially as, Ghana has become so central to this ritual of the return. And the fact that the year of return has become part of this Ghana's nation building kind of diaspora building project that also, to use your language, comes with all its, intentions to obscure. So I think this year, so as part of the year of return, the Ghanaian government, in opening, so I'm thinking of the year of return as a very, I think of it in a very interesting way because it opens up Africa back to the Africans in the diaspora to return. And the Ghanaian government implemented a policy that actually doled out land to Africans in the diaspora. And most of these lands were supposed to be, cheap, and so if you are an African in the diaspora and you are coming to Ghana, you have American dollars, right? And so then you in terms of your monetary background, you are very endowed, right? And so, of course, the government didn't think this through and decided to, and this is also happening within this larger constellation of, trying to make tourism out of slavery and the histories of slavery. Of course, given the fact that Ghana has the largest per capita of slave castles on the West African coast. So then they capitalize on that to, make Ghana the Mecca for Africans in the diaspora to return to. So the government decides to give these lands to Africans in the diaspora without really engaging with the chiefs, then the traditional elders on how to actually, divvy the lands and then give them out to these newcomers or old comers, however you would like to put it. And so this year we've seen a rise in tensions between, for example, African Americans who are in Ghana and have built these incredible buildings and the natives, right? Because the natives are saying that the arrival of these newcomers is displacing them, that their lands are being given without any consent, right? Without their consent to African Americans, Africans in diaspora. And it makes us really sit with what is the right to return, right? That how do we complicate, how do instances like this provoke questioning Black placemaking, right? And maybe an invitation to refuse this homogenization of the Black experience. And I think this is the obscuring that's happening. This is another terraforming, a terraforming that I would argue is occurring under the auspices. And this is really part of a larger global infrastructure, because we are here because, you know, of this history of white supremacist racist capitalism, right? That is what is bringing us back to Ghana to do this again and again and again. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but in a way, I think it's making me think about, and this is not part of my project, so pardon me if I'm not so articulate, but it's really it exemplifies this, you know, the obscure nature of the return. You know, how does the return erase? You know, when you return, who are you displacing? And yeah, thank you.
No, I mean, thank you. What I see from your project is that it is really helping us to think about what legacies we should refuse and kind of excavating a colonial project of the Berlin Conference and seeing how even Black people can kind of imitate that parceling of land and participate in displacement, I think is an important threat to kind of keep in mind. And I guess, Dr. Eaves, my question for you is just methodological, because you interweave so many beautiful aspects of cultural and spatial and spiritual work. And I just was curious, and I'm thinking maybe as a student here of this interdisciplinarity, like how do you decide what mediums are necessary to telling these stories? Do you know what I mean? Like what disciplines to draw on in terms of cultural expressions, et cetera, in your work?
Oh, that's a big one. But can I note, though, that one of the comments that was made last night was about how Black placemaking can replicate American exceptionalism, and that's all I could think about as you were talking just now. Methodologically, I think it's foregrounded first in embodied knowledges, and so it starts with the oral history and the interview and walking interviews, and like, you know, like really being in place and walking with people through like some of those conversations that then helped to see the landscapes kind of differently, and then to think about um, uh, the like reproduction of it, or maybe the production of a new set of archives. So I've been in my conversations with people over the years, I've been very intentional about like, where are those old cassette tapes of the sermons from 1992 that Reverend Montgomery's, you know, like, where is that? Because that's part of our archive. Where is the funeral obituary? One of the, there's a place in Knoxville. The woman just died not that long ago, but she used to cut all the obituary of every Black person from the newspaper and put it in the scrapbook at the Beck Cultural Exchange Center in Knoxville for years. And so now there's this massive, like, how do we like remember and hold ground in a collective, like, ancestral like moment here? That's like one of the wildest things to me, and I think is really telling of like, how do we remember and hold space for people and tell the story of a people in this location. And obituaries for Southerners are really important. So especially Black Southerners, and everybody wants to have their program in their hand, and like, you know, like that's it. It's part of like signifying the connection. So thinking about like, how do we move towards new representations of archives as part of that, and not just in, you know, institutional spaces. I mean, I spent a lot of time last summer, well, 2 summers ago, at North Carolina State University's archives, which is where I went to college, and also like was the agricultural and sort of industrial kind of college of the state, and thinking about like how manufacturing and tobacco and like thinking about plant species and like all these sorts of things that was important. But it's also important to go to North Carolina A&T down the street, which has a different kind of like set of work and a different kind of curatorial practice that like gives them insight too. But I've also been thinking a lot in moving forward about how to do better about, or like kind of how can I like, use technology to sort of open up some of this rather than just always being on the ground. And so this is not a method that I've taken part of, but I've seen where people can like just sort of write in their memories about a place, and like somebody else like kind of curates it and like puts it in this like sort of bigger um, public interface, so that it can be like engaged with in different ways that are not just that exist outside of an academic space, which I think is part of the importance that I'm always trying to think about, like how do we do this like in community and participatory and in other kinds of ways. So those are the two kind of big methodological pieces.
Howard, you did that kind of work when you were beginning to dream of the cultural center and kind of preserving memories and having folks share. Yeah. Thank you for helping us think about how to maybe go beyond the data sets that are traditional, maybe in our separate disciplines. I'd like to open it up to anyone in the audience who might have a question.
You can.
Testing.
Thank you all so much. There's a constellation connection happening in my head that at the end of Dr. Eaves' presentation, you were talking about how the land is reclaiming itself from the interstate construction. It made me think about how last night Dr. Winston talked about the police not being able to get to the community because the roads were so bad. And last week I went to this film screening of a film called The Forgotten Occupation by this Haitian filmmaker, Alan Martin. And he was talking about how when, as I think many of us in this room know, one of the ways that the Haitian Revolution was successful was through its maroon communities and how they used the ecology of the land, and were able to maroon in the mountains. But he said what the United States military did when they came to Haiti in the early 20th century was they built roads through these forested places, and so that rendered them defenseless. So I'm just thinking about, for all of y'all up there, like if you have any thoughts about the relationship between placemaking and the strategy of uh, this reclamation of indigenous or original ecologies. Do you see that show up anywhere in Berry Farm or in Ghana or in the regions that you mapped out, Dr. Eaves?
Can I go? Oh. You know, I've been thinking a lot about mosquitoes. um, your question, because as I am working on this chapter, I've been thinking about mosquito ecologies and malaria in particular, and how, of course, the description of Africa as the white man's grave needs to provoke us into thinking about why it was a white man's grave and what something as insidious as malaria, quite frankly, prevented an all-out onslaught of Africa's colonization, right? And so last week I was at this event in at Michigan State, and a student approached me and they told me about their work on peanut plantations in the Gambia. And I asked them what about peanuts they were studying, and they were like, peanut was, they are looking at pests, right? Pests that demobilize the plantation and the yields and whatnot. And I asked if peanut as a plant was indigenous to the Gambia. And they said no, that peanut was actually introduced to the Gambia by the British because of the environment. And so I asked him, what if, so you're looking at the pest, and I asked, did the insects you are calling pests, were they native to the landscape? And he said he doesn't know. And I'm like, okay, what if, but peanut is the pest because peanut is not native to this landscape, right? So what if what you're calling pest is fighting back because you've introduced a crop that is actually overtaking its landscape, right? And of course, the original pests are those who benefit, those who profiteer of peanuts, who are in the heart of empire, Britain, or in London, right? So I think I'm increasingly beginning to think about how the ways in which we can even think with these insects, how do these insects tell us about colonization, right? And how we think about ecologies, right? And the ways in which we've inherited taxonomies and classifications that impede a critical way of thinking about these flora and fauna that are now pathologized or demonized in the service or in the spirit of colonial expansion or this terraforming that the Europeans engaged in. And I think, when you were talking about the water taking its way, of course, nature would always come back. Nature will tell you you are defenseless. And I appreciate that question because, yes, it is taking back what it's rightfully hers. And you can't question that. And we need to learn to understand that as humans, we are part of this whole thing. It wants us to remind ourselves that we are part of it. We don't dominate it, that we are part of it. It's reminding us to live with it, not control it.
I say preach. It's interesting. The last image, which I realized I didn't talk about, that was on my thank you slide, was of the Ester Mill, which is I grew up down the street from, like literally a 5-minute walk from me. That in its decline and closure over the past now nearly 25 years is being retaken by the land in the same kind of way. It's like just sort of left alone, and now it's being kind of overgrown. The railroad track next to it, which used to be the loading dock, is also overgrown. And it's interesting because the area around it, which was called Esther Village, which was originally a white community that became a lower class Black community, and working class Black community, many of whom worked in the mill itself. A lot of the area, the former homes around the mill have been like sort of razed. And so they're now like this like juxtaposition of like where there were once trees and homes are now like sort of wastelands. And then the plant itself is like being retaken over by the earth. And so it like keeps creating these like interesting, like creates these interesting landscapes to like sit and look at and go back and think about. So that's one of the ways I'm kind of looking at it. And I'm also thinking about the because I'm thinking about Western North Carolina in the aftermath of the hurricane at the moment. I'm also thinking about industrial runoff and like what will like how long or to what extent are the waters contaminated now, because a lot of people don't have water in the region, but the water, like which is meant to be life-giving because of our like impacts cannot be life-giving. And so what do we, like how do we imagine something different or move forward from that? So those are the ways I'm kind of thinking about it.
Sure. Oh, no, that's okay.
This is our last question for this panel.
No pressure.
Okay, I didn't want to do that. Thank y'all so much for a wonderful panel. I just wanted to ask them a quick, hopefully quick questions. I wanted to ask about the relationship to the river that you all mentioned and fishing, and just sort of ask about, I guess you know, in the 1880s, 1890s, Black communities all across the South use rivers and waterways to eat when freedom means you ain't got nothing on your back or nowhere to go. But they, you know, there's at least one former slave narrator, WPA from Mississippi, who said the freedom vision before everything broke down was to go fishing and to see his women. You know what I mean? Like, so I just wonder about that relationship between Black place and freedom and ecologies in the river, and if you all see it as a part of your future work. Also, I just wanted to know about squatting. Like, is that part of the repertoire of DC's like historical right, not just right of return, but right to give us this shit right now in a kind of way? Is that part of that repertoire? Dr. Otu, I want to ask you just about um predictively if you're seeing the kind of, you know, this 1880s moment as a formative, you know, up through now with Security Council and UN and all these kinds of modalities. When you invoke terraform, it invokes intergalactic conquest and spatial transformation, and we're at that horizon. I mean, China and the US, in addition to fighting over the African continent, are fighting over the asteroid belt at this point. So I just wonder if you could, they're literally fighting legally and otherwise about what that looks like. So I just wanted to hear you talk about the Berlin conference in a trajectory that lands at sublunar or post-lunar space, and what that means for Black people in particular.
Okay, I have to note that that's actually two questions.
Oh, yeah.
Those
Well,
are two
no,
great questions. Do we have time for two? Okay, all right.
So I appreciate you sort of raising the question of ecologies. I'm gonna try real hard not to get too much into the weeds of the history, but I'm gonna do it just a tad bit. Interstate 295 was built by Harlan Bartholomew, who was leading the National Capital Planning Commission back in the 20s. If y'all don't know, look his name up. He's responsible for Interstate 95. He's responsible for a lot of the interstate highway system in this country. He was appointed to the National Highway Board by FDR after World War II. He is responsible for dissecting Black communities and then in turn inundating them with industry. Okay. DC is not an isolated case. 295 was built, and then the city, and I say the city, not the federal government, the city and the federal government were burning municipal waste on the riverbed. And I think early in the 20th century, when they sort of got caught when a kid died in a fire down there, they said, "Oh, okay, well, we're going to stop burning waste." And then they didn't bother to clean it up. What they did was they backfilled the property. And so if you go down to Kenilworth Gardens, the only thing that's there is soil sitting on top of municipal waste, right? Pepco plant was down there on the river. Pepco was trying to build an expansion years ago, and thanks to the River Terrace Community Organization, that didn't happen. But they also allowed waste to seep into the river, which is why we can't use the river now. They're telling us that the river's safe to swim in. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't go out there trying to catch catfish. Don't do that. That said, what I would like to see is long term the legacy project. I see it as an effort to sort of tear apart a lot of the sort of impositions that communities have been inundated with, and I think that, you know, that starts for me with burying 295 or getting rid of it altogether. I mean, and look, I'm gonna be curt, right? Because I think that part of it is, you know, the highway was built there, and just bear with me for a moment. I know I'm rambling. The city was constructed in a way that Southeast Washington was not a part of the plan. Northwest Washington was not a part of the plan. Where Black folk used to live was not a part of the plan. Okay, there was already a physical barrier, the river. They didn't need to build another one; they wanted to. Right? Anacostia Park, when it was built, they built up the pavilion and all the stuff that's down there now. White folk used that in the 40s. It wasn't until later in the 50s when integration came to Southeast Washington and white folk threw a fit and then left Southeast Washington that Black folk were allowed to use the pool, were allowed to go skate at the pavilion, right? What I would like to see is a reclamation of the space. I'd like to see some conversation take place around burying 295, restoring access to the river, and then realizing the waterfront that was initially conceived for the Anacostia waterfront when George Washington brought us here as the national capital. The goal was to build a waterfront in Southeast Washington. Imagine the future that could have been realized if you sort of drop that into the historical context and then just pivot a little bit and allowed integration to take place the way that it did. You'd have a waterfront on the Southeast Anacostia. You would have bustling communities, bustling businesses owned and run by Black people. And because consistently the city and the federal government interrupted those efforts, we're here. I'll note also just that like this land was also home to the Nacotchtank people, right? And frankly, organizations like Empower and others, we're doing a little bit to like push the narrative on bringing indigenous plants back to the space. I think there needs to be a larger conversation in the land back movement about what it means to restore access to property for indigenous people. And that's something that, you know, the space more broadly just is not doing enough of because it's a difficult conversation. And I think the more we lean into those conversations, the more we can have equitable conversations about what land back really means.
I was wrong. There were 3 questions. I'm going to ask if we talk about squatting over lunch, and we'll let Dr. Otu address the question.
Professor Rowan, thank you very much. You know, I've always thought of this intergalactic interstellar wars that we are witnessing as of course not very different from the Berlin conference and the wars that anticipated it. I think even when in the contemporary moment we talk about not finding life on other planets, it's like the same language that was used to justify colonization, right? That there's no life there. I mean, they are dehumanized. So in place of dehumanization, we are delifing other planets, right? By using our life on Earth to gauge or measure the existence or non-existence of life elsewhere. Right, and so in fact, the Berlin Conference becomes the core, if you will, for these kinds of imaginary journeys that we see being pursued by, these global powers, right, in their desire to colonize other planets. And I would want to also add that, Black people have never been flat earthers, you know, because, you can go amongst the Dogon tribe, the Zulus, the Ashantis, that we've always held on to or had our own interstellar epistemologies, right? We had embraced astral projections. I mean, you can even see from amongst the Moors and their investment. There was a whole institute on studying, the other worlds, right? And so this is my way of saying that, like, I feel the Berlin Conference, in a way, has provided us with the vocabulary, the language, and the framework on which these extra intergalactic pursuits are based, and that we are witnessing once more what happened to us. Africa is a wasteland, like all the other Mars is a lifeless planet, right? So we can just go and do whatever we want, right? And we must be concerned about these reproductions, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, audience, for staying. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Morrison for announcement.